Check, 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 check. Can you hear me now? I can hear it a little bit. Good evening, everybody. How are we tonight? Good. So, if you don't mind, we're going to go ahead and get started because it is 6 o'clock on the dot. So, I'm glad you guys could all come out and make it tonight. We're going to get started with a word of prayer. So, if you wouldn't mind to close your eyes and bow your heads. Dear God, thank you so much for the opportunity to meet together tonight. Thank you for the building that you've blessed us with. And thank you for giving us more than what we ever deserve. God, I appreciate everything that you do for us and all of the blessings that you give us when we don't ask for them, God, and especially when we don't deserve them. God, I pray that you would focus our hearts and minds on you tonight and let us worship you and lift up your voice, God. And I pray that it would be a blessing to your ears. In your name I pray. Amen. Okay. Please stand if you can.
Lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love.
our God.
Thank you. Well, that's good. Good. That song in particular is just one of my favorites. Just the whole idea. The question, how great is our God? And the answer is not one of us have an answer. He's greater than anything that we can imagine. Well, glad that you're here tonight. Appreciate Barry filling in last week, and understand it was a close thing. You sang and he walked in and he did church, and that all worked out. So I appreciate him doing that. Do have some sheets there in the back if you've not got one. Kind of want to go a little different direction. We've been talking about some background. This is another kind of a lesson that really comes out of biblical backgrounds classes. I want to talk about some of the characters that are in the Bible. Some of the groups that are in the Bible, and maybe just talk a little bit about who they are, because as you read it makes a difference. In fact, if you want to start out, you might just take a little bit of a look, Mark chapter 14, just as kind of a place to begin. In Mark chapter 14, there are different groups that are mentioned, and so from our sheet I want to talk about that. Chapter 14, verse 1, it was now 2 days before the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him. Down in verse 10, Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray them to him. Then, let's see, verse 43, and immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and the chief priests and scribes and the elders. And then verse 53, and they led Jesus to the high priest and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes together. There's these groups that are there, and I'm sure you've come across them at different times, but want to just take a few different ideas and talk about some of the groups, and maybe just begin really basic. Who are the Jews? They are definitely, technically, descendants biologically of Abraham. That if you are not a descendant, if you cannot go back in your heritage and at some point get to Abraham, you are not a Jew. A Jew is a descendant of Abraham. Now, there's lots of intermarrying. There are a lot of things that went on. I knew a guy in Effingham who was like 164th Jew. It kind of went back, but Jew is a genealogical, biological reality that you trace your family tree back, and Abraham, if he's up there somewhere, that's necessary to be a Jew. The next term is Gentile. Who are Gentiles? Everybody else are Gentiles, and that's kind of the way that works. Now, there is another term that my marker's going to eventually die, but God-fearer or proselyte. I don't know how you spell that. L-Y-T-E. Proselyte. So, a God-fearer, and I'm trying to think, there's at least one biblical character that's referred to as a God-fearer, and I should have looked that up. Somebody can probably Google that, just God-fearer in the Bible. But at any rate, a God-fearer or a proselyte is someone who is a Gentile, but who has determined to follow the God of the Old Testament. And in the temple, there was a courtyard, and the court was of women and Gentiles. And so there were always individuals who came and believed in the God of the Old Testament, who believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but were Gentiles. Now, they could never become a Jew officially, because that's a biological thing. They could follow Judaism, and they could believe in the God of the Old Testament. So there's Jews and Gentiles who believe, and there was even a baptism process. There was a rite of process. If you were a man, you could be circumcised, but you still were never a Jew. Jew is a biological term. But you could be a God-fearer or a proselyte. And so that makes sense. Jews, Gentiles, two kinds of people, and then Gentiles who choose to follow the God of Judaism. By the way, today it's estimated that probably 10% of Jews worship the God of Abraham. 10% in Israel, 10% of Jews go to synagogue. They're not a very religious people. Even in America, individuals who are physically Jews, very few of them really go to any kind of synagogue service, observe anything. It's just kind of the way it is. It's more of a race thing than it is a faith thing, tragically. So those are some terminologies. Now, in the Bible, there are a lot of groups that are mentioned that sort of play out, that are subsets of all of these. So the priests, there are 12 descendants of, you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has 12 boys, and they become the 12 tribes. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, so the 12 tribes of Israel are the 12 sons of Jacob, and one of them is Levi. And the descendants of Levi are the Levites. And the Levites as a whole were pretty much the custodians, the physical labor in the tabernacle. That's all established in the book of Exodus. And if you are a descendant of Levi, you are available to be a Levite. In fact, I think in the Good Samaritan, one of the three guys that passes by on the other side is a Levite. Now, the Levites are not all priests. Only the section of Levites who are descendants of Aaron. So Aaron was a Levite, and Aaron is set aside, and only his descendants could be priests. So you have Levites, and the Levites, as far as we know, in the tabernacle, they set it up, they carried it, they broke it down, they got the wood, they did all of the main cleaning, and evidently in the temple, there were Levites who worked, and they rotated. They would work for a month, then Levites from someplace else, and there were cities. The Levites never got any land when they went into the land of Israel that was designated. They had cities scheduled and spread throughout the land of Israel. So the Levites did the physical labor, but only descendants of Levi through Aaron could be priests. And so the priests kind of break down into a couple of them. First of all, there is a high priest. And that was kind of a political thing. It was an elected thing. The two that we know about in the Bible are Annas and then his son Caiaphas. And they are elected by the body of priests. And they were the high priests during their time. They were in charge of pretty much everything that went on at the temple. They were in charge of the sacrifices. They were in charge of everything. They were the CEO of the temple, the high priest. And the two we know of are Annas and Caiaphas. And the high priest had a special house with a room big enough for everybody to meet in. And when Jesus was arrested by soldiers sent by Caiaphas, the high priest, he was brought to the high priest's house. So there's a high priest. Then there's the term chief priests. And evidently at the temple, there were priests who were full-time. They worked, lived in Jerusalem, and they were there. They were administrators. They made sure the fees were collected and the offerings that were collected, and they oversaw the work of everything that went on. They were the chief priests. And then there were just regular, everyday priests, descendants of Aaron, spread throughout all the land of Israel. The one we know the most about is a guy by the name of Zechariah, whose wife was Elizabeth. Who was their son? John the Baptist. And Zechariah hears that his wife is going to have a son while he is at the temple taking his turn. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian in the first century, and that's where we learn about how a lot of it went on. But Joseph said that there was a lottery every year. So you live out in the land of Israel and you are a descendant of Aaron, or you're a Levite. The lottery said, you Levites are going to come and work this month, and you Levites are going to come and work this month, and you are going to come and work this month. Well, there was a lottery for priests as well. So these are not the high priest or the chief priest. These are just other descendants of Aaron, so there's lots of them. And a lottery was done, and evidently they would work a month at a time, and it would be possible to be a descendant of Aaron and maybe be chosen to work in the temple at Jerusalem once in your lifetime. So it was a pretty rare thing. Zechariah was chosen. That may have been the first time or the only time he was ever there at the temple when God spoke to him. That would be kind of interesting. But they were chosen by lottery, and those were the priests that took the offerings, the sacrifice, the lamb, cut the throat, let the blood spill out. The Levites are cleaning up the mess, but the priest is making the offering. The high priest is the only one who goes into the Holy of Holies, does that once a year. So that's the priests. And so Levites, descendants of Levi, and then out of the Levites, descendants of Aaron, are the priests. And there's a high priest and chief priests, and then there were other priests who would serve periodically. Does that make sense? Y'all already knew that, didn't you? I knew you did. I knew you did. Now, there were some other groups, and the two that we are the most familiar with were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Those were sort of political groups. And when we get to the Sanhedrin, that'll explain itself. But the Sadducees were a religious sect. And they were mostly priests. They tended to be, wealthier. They tended to be people who had property, who owned property. They generally were wealthier people, and they were a religious group. They had influence, they had seats, they would be on the Sanhedrin, and most of the priests tended to be Sadducees. Now, the unique thing about the Sadducees, one, is they didn't believe in angels, and two, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They believed when you die, that's it. Now, they also believed, consequently, that if God blessed you because you were righteous, where did you get those blessings? When did you get them? Here. And they tended to be rich. And so they tended to say, we must be righteous because look at the money we got. God blessed us in this world, and they believed when you died, that was it. Now, a couple interesting things. You remember Jesus is asked a question about a woman who married a husband, and the husband died. And then the brother married her under the Levitical law of levirate marriage, and he died. And then the next brother married her, and he died. You kind of wonder about her cooking, don't you? I mean, Black Widow or something. I don't know what's going on. But she ends up marrying 7 brothers, and all of the brothers died. And the question they ask of Jesus is, so whose wife will she be in the judgment, in the resurrection? Well, if you read that story, do you know who it is who asked the question? It's Sadducees, who didn't even believe in the resurrection. That's just how absurd that question was, but it was asked by them. And then also, Paul, later on, when he is on trial in the Sanhedrin, is going to, there's this group, and some of them are Sadducees, some of them Pharisees, and he is going to say, I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead. And all the Pharisees are going to say, yeah, and all the Sadducees are going to say, no, and he really did mess that meeting up. He really did mess it up because of this. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. Now, of the two groups, this is something from my mother. She said the way she could remember that the Sadducees were the ones who didn't believe in heaven because they were sad, you see, because they didn't have anything to look forward to after death. So the Sadducees were a religious group. They were a sect. They tended to be wealthy. They tended to have influence and power. That's who the Sadducees were. The Pharisees, there were never a ton of Pharisees. I think Josephus says the most there ever was at one time were 6,000 Pharisees in the whole Jewish nation. Pharisees were men who made a vow, and the vow was to obey the law of God with all of their ability. The Old Testament law, Levitical law, what was later called the oral law, the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Mishnah and Talmud, the oral law, they said we're going to obey the law with everything we possibly are. So up front, that's not a bad thing, is it? I mean, we're going to obey the law of God. We're with all of our strength, we're going to obey the law. Well, that's a pretty good start, and it probably was a good thing. They would be really good neighbors. We would probably let them be deacons in the church. I don't know. We'd at least, because they believed in tithing, they believed in a lot of, they were godly in many respects. They focused really intently on the Sabbath. And all those questions about obeying the Sabbath and what you could do on the Sabbath, they were really honed in on the Sabbath and keeping it. They were really big on clean and unclean. So they washed their hands, and they were very careful, and they avoided dead things, and they really went hard on being clean. Prayer was a big thing. Those stories about the men who stopped on the street corner at the hour of prayer. The Pharisees prayed 3 times a day, and there was always set times. And the early Christians, we know, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the hour of prayer when they see the guy and say, silver and gold have I none. They were on their way at the hour of prayer. Well, evidently there were Pharisees who, if they were out on the city streets and it was the hour of prayer, it was noon, they would just stop and pray right there. But they would pray at least 3 times a day. They typically were small businessmen. By the vow, they were required to support themselves and have a job and be respectable people of commerce. They were usually not wealthy people, but they made vows to do that. The most famous of the Pharisees is who? Paul, who was not just a Pharisee, but by his own account was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. So you had these two groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And those were the 2 main groups. And there were subgroups among them, but the Pharisees believed in eternal life, they believed in heaven, they believed in eternal judgment. They believed big time in hell. And they were pretty sure that Gentiles and anybody who wasn't as godly as them probably was going to hell. That was pretty significant. A third group were the scribes, and they're mentioned quite often. The scribes originally were just literally guys who were literate. They could read, they could write, and they were copiers of the Bible. I mean, we've talked about all those copies that were old on hand. So you had the whole room, and you were all scribes. And I'd say, in, and you'd all write in. The, beginning, God, created. You'd all do that, and that's how they made copies. Actually, Bara, Berith, Elohim, and you'd all get it all down right. And that's originally what the scribes did. But eventually they became, because they made copies, and they made copies of the prophets, but most of their work was done with the first 5 books, which are called the Torah, the Pentateuch, the law. And they really focused heavily on the law. And because of that, they ended up knowing the law better than most people, so they are also sometimes called lawyers, because they knew the Old Testament law. And eventually, because they knew it, a sort of side business that people with disagreements about business, about slaves, about property, about anything that is talked about in the first 5 books of the Bible, you would go to a lawyer, a scribe, and he would give you a legal interpretation. The scribes also, while they were doing that, developed, these scribes and lawyers, developed additional writings to help interpret the law that became the oral tradition or the oral law. The Mishnah is the big one. There is also Talmud, which is, the Mishnah was commentary on the law. The Talmud was commentary on the Mishnah, which was commentary on the law. So you get all of these things, and the one that you most likely have heard about is with the Sabbath. So the law says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Thou shalt do no work on the Sabbath. So the lawyers got busy on, so what's work and what's not work? And I'm sure you have heard in the Mishnah, there are over 600 separate entities, separate lines of discussion about what you could do on the Sabbath and what you couldn't do on the Sabbath. And I'm sure you've heard some of those bizarre things. For instance, if you were a tailor, if you were a seamstress, and a needle got stuck in your garment, and you carried it and walked on the Sabbath, that was sin, because the needle was your tool for work, and you carried a tool for work, so that was sin. How far you could walk on the Sabbath. Eventually, they said a Sabbath day's journey, which ended up being about 3 blocks. And it could be longer than that, depending on how big the city was. And then, of course, the Pharisees took all of that stuff to heart and then really went out of their way to figure out how to get around those things. For instance, if you could only go a certain distance, they would rope off the entire city and make it into 1 block so you could go as far as you wanted. But my favorite one was knots. Tying a knot on the Sabbath, according to the Mishnah, was a sin. That was work. So, except for a woman could tie a knot in her girdle. So there is actually recorded stories about Pharisees tying their wife's girdle, a knot to the bucket and the other knot to the rope, so they could lower the rope down on the Sabbath and draw water, and got around the knot business. Now, this got really silly, really serious stuff. And they became so caught up in these little silly things that that's one of the reasons Jesus said, you're hypocrites. And that you strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. And Jesus said to them, you're all about, and if that's the life you choose, Pharisees more than the Sadducees, they chose to say, we're perfect. We're going to obey all the laws. And so they gave off the impression. They wanted to look like righteous. And Jesus said of them, specifically of the Pharisees, you are whitewashed tombs. You're like a mausoleum painted pretty white on the outside, but inside you're full of dead men's bones. Well, this had to do with the scribes. They were the ones who made the laws. There were teachers of the law, which were individuals who, some of the scribes, but rabbis. Now, the idea of a synagogue, by the time of Jesus, there were synagogues. There was a synagogue in Capernaum where Jesus was. In fact, that's one of the places we were talking about. If you go to Israel, you go to the synagogue in Capernaum, there are stones there that date back to the time of Jesus. So if you walk around there, you're in a place Jesus was. You can't say that about every place in Israel, but you can do that. Synagogues really sprang up during the time of the exile, when the temple was destroyed. And you couldn't go to Jerusalem to the temple 3 times a year, and so there began to be, particularly in Babylon, later on in Persia, that Jews began to meet wherever they were. And they set up the idea of a synagogue. And the rules by Jesus' day, you had to have 10 families. 10. 10 families, 10 men to establish a synagogue. And by the way, that's still true today in Jewish life. You have to have 10 families at least to establish a synagogue. And so you'd have 10, and to have a meeting. 10 men was the quorum. You technically couldn't have a service if you didn't have at least 10 men show up for synagogue. Well, that's when the idea of a rabbi began to come. And so rabbis became very much, for us, like what a pastor is, who taught, who preached, and who did pastoral care. And so rabbis became more important. They were teachers, and that's a term that was used for Jesus as a teacher. He was called rabbi. In fact, even in the resurrection, they call him Rabboni, which was kind of you're my favorite one. And almost all of the rabbis during Jesus' day had their own disciples. The 2 most famous rabbis, at least that are known, because they were during the time of Jesus roughly, a Rabbi Hillel and a Rabbi Shammai. And the big deal was they debated greatly the biblical grounds for divorce. And if you've ever done any reading biblically about divorce, one of them said, get rid of your wife for any reason. If she's gotten old, get rid of her. If you don't like the way she cooks, if the food she makes isn't good, get rid of her. The other one said, almost no cause is good for divorce. Well, Jesus weighed in on that pretty heavily. But there were rabbis, and they taught. And today in synagogues, where's the nearest synagogue here? Anybody know? Carbondale? I would assume there'd be one in Carbondale. I know there was one in Centralia, a pretty big Jewish population up around us. You had to go to Champaign. Charleston had a pretty good synagogue. And normally, they will have their own rabbi, just like you have a pastor, and they will have their services. Typically, the services, they do some things on Friday night because Sabbath begins Friday evening, but normally, and by the way, today there are Orthodox Jews who are very serious. The guys will wear the prayer cloth and black and the hats. The Hasidic Jews wear the fur hats and have the little curly cues on their side and have the prayer shawls. But then there's a whole lot of Jews that are not Orthodox, and probably in America there's more non-Orthodox Jews, and they'll go and would have a service not unlike ours, and everything would be done in English. When I was in seminary in Hebrew class, we got to go to a service, and they really weren't orthodox. They did conduct the service in Hebrew, and they brought the Torah out, and the rabbi read from the Torah, and there was the place for the 10 elders, the 10 men to sit, to have a position to say, yes, we're here. And it was family, and families came together. They had a Sabbath school, and they kind of like Sunday school for Jewish children to learn their faith, and then they would have a service. And they would have synagogue service. So that's not unusual. So now, biblically, the Sanhedrin is the group that plays out. And in the Sanhedrin, it was made of Sadducees and Pharisees. There were priests there, because most of the priests were Sadducees. There was also a group called elders, or the rulers of the people. Now, together, all of the Sanhedrin kind of got that title of rulers of the people. There was a Sanhedrin law from the time of the, actually back from the time of the exile, so 400, 500, 600 years before, there was a time of the Sanhedrin. During Jesus' day, there were 70 members of the Sanhedrin. And evidently at Caiaphas' house, there was a room where 70 men could sit. And some of them would be priests and Sadducees. There would be some who would be scribes. There would be some rabbis. There would be a group of Pharisees. You could almost think House of Representatives. And they were appointed, and there was a lot of different processes. Some years the Sanhedrin was smaller. There were some years there was only 25 or 30. And the Sanhedrin, during the time of Christ, had authority, but it was always under the Roman Empire. And the Romans, they came to the place that it would be easier for the Sanhedrin to govern the people and enforce laws than for them to have to step in and solve everything. But they had limited power. Evidently, the Sanhedrin did have the power to have a person beaten. And there is some suggestion that maybe they could have a person whipped. By the way, Jews whipped on the front because of needing to face your accusers. And so if they were going to be flogged by the Jews, you would stand against the wall and your accuser would stand over there. And they had very specific rules. You couldn't convict anybody of anything unless you had at least 2 and preferably 3 witnesses that all agreed. Now that all plays out in the trial of Jesus, doesn't it? They couldn't find everybody to agree. He might have been whipped, but the Sanhedrin did not have the authority to do what? To put a man to death. They didn't. Now, they did in previous years. Before that, they did, but under Roman rule, they could not put a man to death, which is why they convicted Jesus. By the way, what did they convict him of? Blasphemy. You know, the Romans didn't care at all about blasphemy. They didn't care whether you thought you were God or not. So when they got to the Romans, what was the charge? Insurrection, treason, leading a revolt. They changed it. And by the way, one of the rules of the Sanhedrin was they only were allowed to meet during the daylight. And the idea was that all of our decisions should be done in open daylight. It's pretty hard to see that they tried Jesus and went through all of that and got him to Pilate at daybreak if they didn't violate their own rules and meet at night. Well, so the Sanhedrin was the council of Jewish leaders. They were sometimes called the elders, sometimes they were called the rulers, sometimes they were called the council. But those are the groups that for the most part play out in the biblical story, and they were a part of Jewish life in the days of Jesus. And Josephus, I actually own a copy of Josephus, and I've never read it all. I read a little summary of it. It's really dry, but he was a Jewish historian who wrote under contract from the Romans. The Romans paid him to write a history of Jewish life, and so he writes about life in the first century. So a lot of what we know about biblical backgrounds comes from what Josephus wrote. And have you heard that name before? I mean, and he pretty significant, heavy-sized book, but he wrote in a lot of what we know about how they conducted stuff. So, questions about all? That's a lot of stuff. That, by the way, if you don't know any of that, your life's still okay. Sure.
The Muslims, they claim Abraham as their father too.
Yes.
Are they descended from Abraham?
Question is about Muslims who claim Father Abraham as well. You want to go down this rabbit hole? We can do it quick. I think we can do it real quick. All right, Abraham, God's chosen. God said, going to make you a great nation. How many sons did he have? Abraham had 2 sons. Who was the oldest? Ishmael. And who was his mother? Hagar was the mother. That was the first and the oldest son. But that was not the son that God intended him to have. He kind of went around because Sarai didn't get pregnant quick, and so he has a second child. And what's the name of that child? Isaac. All right, I-S-A, 2 A's, Isaac. Okay, so while we're at it, Isaac has 2 sons whose names are? Jacob. You gave me a better one and I set it down. All right. Jacob. And who's the other one? Esau. All right. So Jacob and Esau, just let's run this part of it down. The descendants of Esau are the Edomites. And if you go down along the Dead Sea, on the other side of the Dead Sea, that was the area of Edom. If you've ever heard of Petra, Petra was kind of a, if you've ever seen, is it Raiders of the Lost Ark? It's the 3rd one. Anyway, they supposedly, you go down, and I've been down the Seek, and you come out to that place, and there's all those buildings. There's nothing inside them. The Ark is not there. We're not, the Holy Grail is not there. None of that stuff's there. But Petra is a really neat place to go. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau. Jacob has how many sons? 12 sons. Anybody else? Dinah, at least one daughter. So Dinah, but he has 12 sons. And his name gets changed to Israel. And so his 12 children are the children of Israel, and that becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. And Levi is one, because we talked about him, and one of Levi's descendants is Aaron, and so that's where you get the priest. Jesus is descendant from which of those boys? Judah. And so Reuben, Simeon, Joseph, Benjamin, anyway. So those are the, so let's go back over to Ishmael. Ishmael is sent away with Hagar after Isaac is born. And in some sense, Abraham probably didn't treat him very well. And while they're out, Hagar calls out to God, and God promises to bless her and her son. The Muslim teaching is that Ishmael also had 12 sons. And those sons are the descendants of Ishmael, and much of Middle Eastern world are descendants through Ishmael, whose father was Abraham. And so most of the Arabic-speaking people, other folks, pretty much all of the Middle East that eventually are descendants all claim Abraham. Now, this all happens, and then eventually, about 600 A.D., I just can't get these things to right. Well, I tried the black one. Let me try the red one, see if it does. But about 600, it's actually about, I think about 630 A.D., a descendant of Ishmael and Abraham by the name of Muhammad supposedly had a vision in which God told him to fix religion and get it straightened out, and to do it in a variety of different ways. And he wrote down what supposedly God told him in a book called the Quran. And the Quran becomes the holy book of Muslims. And there are 5 pillars of Islam. Prayer is one of them. The creed, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Prayer 6 times a day, I think, maybe 5, I can't remember. Pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in your life, or Medina. One of them is jihad, and jihad, the word means struggle. And there's some question, depending on which Muslims you talk to, they will say it's the struggle to live a godly life. But radical Muslims say that's holy war. And Muhammad did get lots of followers, mostly by the sword. He went and conquered towns and said, "Y'all believe, don't you?" And everybody said yes. And Islam spread. And Islam continued to spread. They eventually take the land of Israel. The 3 holy sites in Islam are Mecca, where he had his, I think it's where he had his vision. Medina, I think, is where he was born. It's maybe one of those. And Jerusalem, because he evidently had a dream, and in a dream, he was spirited away from Mecca or Medina, wherever he was, to Jerusalem. And that's why there is a very sacred to Muslims mosque on the Temple Mount. The Dome of the Rock is there. And that is the 3rd holiest site for Muslims. So they take it pretty serious, but they all claim descendants back to Ishmael and to Abraham. And so they claim Father Abraham, which, by the way, if Abraham was given the promised land, who does the land typically go to? To the oldest son. So do you understand why they think they have a claim to the land of Palestine? Because Abraham is their father. So they've been fighting for a long time. The boys didn't get along back then. They're still not getting along. So I don't know if that helped or solved the question or not, but at least I wanted to throw that out there. We can do that more someday and go farther, but is that enough? I think so. I hope that's at least, and again, there's no real test on this, but if you hear those things, if you're reading the New Testament and it's the chief priests, well, those were the administrators, the bureaucrats, frankly, the politicians at the temple. The Levites, those were the workers. The priests, well, there were regular priests and the high priest and the council. Well, that's all those folks, the Sadducees, the Pharisees. And honestly, they were probably, some of them, very good hearts. Joseph of Arimathea was almost certainly a Sadducee. Probably. Very likely. Nicodemus probably was a Pharisee. They end up becoming friends, by the way. Worked together to help bury Jesus. So a lot of different things go on, but anyway, while we're pulling stuff out. Yes, ma'am.
How do we go back into this? Where do we come from?
We're Gentiles. We are outsiders. We are outside of the Jewish faith, and we are adopted. We are adopted because we're not in any one of those. We are Gentiles. Of course, there was all kinds of other people in the world. Well, we technically are not proselytes to Judaism because what's most important is that we have approached God not through Jewish law, but through the blood of Jesus Christ. And that's how we approach Him. So we are adopted. I love that idea. We are adopted. And we become joint heirs with Jesus. And Jesus makes us a place. And we enter the family of God not because of biology, not because who our parents are. We come to God and approach Him by faith in our hearts. And that's where the New Testament takes us. And that's why Jesus came. This is the vehicle by which the Savior came, but we approach Him in an entirely different way because we are Gentiles. And I'm kind of glad that there was that thing in the Great Commission about go into all the world and preach the gospel. I'm kind of glad on the day of Pentecost that there were folks from at least 15 different nations that heard the gospel and believed. I kind of like that they were told to go and take the gospel into Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the rest of the world. And I don't know, I'm thinking Southern Illinois is pretty much the uttermost parts of the world. I mean, you and I don't think about that from here, but if you stop and think from, this would be pretty much the uttermost ends of the world from the Middle East. But aren't you glad the gospel got here? And Jesus gave us that plan and that purpose. And this is all a part of His plan, and the Bible is the story, and that's what we've been focusing on. But in the end, it's the message that Jesus brought and the message that the Bible gets. And the more you understand about the Bible, the clearer it's going to make that Jesus is clearly the answer. Well, okay. And by the way, I'm always willing to talk about this stuff. And I try not to just make up stuff as I go along. But it is pretty interesting, and this would be basically a Bible college, Bible backgrounds class. That's the kind of stuff you'd talk about just to get some of those characters. So I appreciate you indulging me, let me pull out my files. I was dragging stuff out this week, and I thought about drawing the map of Israel and making you get a piece of paper and make your own map and put in the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee and Bethlehem, and we may save that for another night. We may get to that. I think you would enjoy that, and I think it actually would be surprising how valuable it would be. Well, the Jeffers family, a lot of just things have gone real south. And so thinking about them. Other prayer requests.